Okay, good morning. A good Geben Shiur. I hope everyone was saturated with the simcha of Sukkot and Shana Rabbi, Shmini Atzeres, and Simchas Torah. And now we carry it into the Fanander Pak in the Peklach. We unpack the luggage that we gathered. Okay, so let us resume where we left off. We're in Ayin Beis, Volume 3. And where did we reach? I believe we concluded, last class was the top of page 1248. Am I correct? I'm almost sure that's correct. Yeah. And in the paragraph on page Aleph Resh Mem Ches, top of Aleph Resh Mem Ches. So I think we all could use a refresher and a summary so we can get back up to speed where we're up to. So the entire section here is part of the conversation about the different levels of the maturation and the growth and development of the mind and the emotions of a human being. And namely here in the context of Avodas Hashem, as we develop more mature tools, as our tools become more mature in our understanding and our emotional experience of godliness, which she called the three levels of Mutfa, Murgish, and Muskel, or Ibbur Sheini Moichin, with the first beginning with just the bare behavioral elements of reflexive and natural emotions of a young newborn, or state of Ibbur, where everything is just completely biological and not yet developed into something that you can call a little more conscious, moving toward a state of conscious emotions. And then as they get informed and grow through the mind, as the mind develops as well, to the point that the mind can actually then initiate and create and generate emotions that are not necessarily only natural by birth, emotions that come from contemplation. And that too has many levels. There was the Murgish Mitzad HaSeichel, meaning that it's still primarily emotions, but the emotions now are being guided and directed by the mind. And then there is where the mind becomes more powerful and is able to abstract and go into and able to envision and understand and relate to experiences that are higher than the subjective interest of the human being, because emotions ultimately are subjective. And that mind in turn affects the emotions, that the emotions should also become what he called midas sichlim, emotions that are far more elevated and refined, because they are now midas sichlim, guided by and determined and defined by the mind. And that too there was bina, chachma, chetzenis hameichin, primis hameichin, all the way to the highest levels of primis of chachma, where the midas are completely absorbed as the mind is with a reality that's higher than it. And that too draws out the emotional, natural emotions, like he spoke about two levels of the natural emotions. There's the natural emotions as they are from birth. I'm referring now to page, let me just tell you what page it's on, page 1243, because that's going to be relevant now as we continue learning this subject matter. So he talks there about midas tivim, that the midas that are in a state of what he called Ibbur Sheini, the first pregnancy. So here the midas are still like we talk about Eim Revetzes ala Frechim, that the mother is hovering over and protecting and nurturing its offspring, which in this case bina, as it relates to emotions. So that he called was the earlier stage, and then that bechinas Ibbur Deza bebeten ima. And then there comes a stage, once the mind begins to develop further, the shalach to shalach hasa'im, where you send away the mother, that the midas are at a point where the mother can go return back to her natural place, which is side by side, the same stature as Chachma. It's called what he called atzmius of bina, and that too is number one. The midas feed that and elevate the mind, and help catapult the mind to that place, and in turn, the midas too become elevated to a level of that nature as well. And he called that on page 1243, Ibbur Sheini Deza, where the midas are now l'mayla metam v'das. In other words, they're not just the midas, the natural, subjective, behavioral reflexive behavior that we spoke about, but rather they are now the deepest, a very deep level of midah, as they are rooted in the etzem haneshama, even higher than the meichin, like we said, that zah, ba'atika achad detalia, that zah, the midas, are rooted in atik, even higher than where seichel is rooted. And together, the human being experiences the divine both on the highest cognitive level and the highest emotional level. So now we're talking about obviously very high levels in mudva murgish muskel, or in Ibbur Sheini in meichin, that the midas are extremely refined and not, they've discovered that they experience godliness that is not just about the subjective needs, but the very emotions are also experiencing something beyond our own existence. That's in summary what we're talking about here. So I'm going to go over this a little more in detail when we learn it now, when we continue learning, but I want to continue the summary as we are where we're up to right now. So then the Rebbe Rashab defined all this by explaining it in the context of Ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha. Now b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, he said, is, and I'm reading now, I'm looking at same page, 1243, but going on all the way to page 1245, that he says, so the two avis, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha, is still minatam v'aseichel. That's still the seichel is creating, it's contemplating on godliness and creating such a love. B'chol meidecha, on the other hand, is a ava atzmis, is a core love. But in b'chol meidecha itself, there are two levels. There's a core love from the natural fact that the soul is connected to God, and the mind is not really involved in that, only to make you aware of the godliness. And then the Ayin Beis in b'chol meidecha, K'sha'avi be'emek nekudas hanefesh, and this was with the hamokas haseichel, the person is completely, they're using the example, completely immersing themselves and delving into something that's negei benefesh, chayi nafshi, shedover shechayev tluyim boy. That when you use your mind for regular contemplation, you use it to some extent, but when you use it to something that's negei to your life and to life itself, then a whole different dimension of intellect is revealed. And that's the higher level of b'chol meidecha, total absorption. So it's not just the atzmis hanefesh, a reflection of the atzmis hanefesh, as he said. Like he gave the example of the koil pashut. There's a koil. So there's a voice, a sound that comes with words. That's like b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha. Then there's a voice that doesn't have words, but there's a sound. And then there's a voice, a sound that doesn't even have a sound, because it's completely connected to the core, and it changes the person, completely transforms them. So in Atzmis HaNefesh itself of B'chol Meidecha, there's these two levels. And one is Bina, as it's connected to the Midas, and one is Bina as it's on its own. But now, let's just see the words he used there. I'm looking at page 1246 if you're interested. He says that when something comes, is spilus from its hatfa, as much as it's deep, it's still the chitzenius of the atzmius. And when it's ahim hamokas hadas, is the primius of the atzmius. It says at the end of the paragraph on page 1246. Okay. Then he applied that to the davening, the tefillah of Chana, which was without words. She was just, but it was from the depths of her heart. Kela lo yishma. They did not hear a sound. So he talks about is that deeper level, that deeper dimension. Okay. Okay. Then the end of paragraph on page 1246, 1247 was the Tanya chapter 50, where he talked about these levels, the levels of Smoyin. First there's thirst. That's still the chitzenius of the etzem. And that leads to chelas ava, where a person is completely affected by it, infected, you can even say, in a positive way, that the love is creating a chela, like a love sickness. And then there's Kleis HaNefesh. As he explains there, Kleis HaNefesh is the highest level, where a person is completely absorbed and completely, his soul is fainting, literally, is experiencing this higher level of the divine, which he called a Kleis HaNefesh. And that Kleis HaNefesh, let me just see, is a form of Ava Barish Beis, fire. But then you come to the level, what he called was the level of water, the love of water, which quenches the thirst and causes the person not just to expire, but to come down below and do the Aveda of Torah Mitzvah Shuv. That's the top of page 1247. Yeah. So the ultimate goal, even a Primis Atzmis HaNefesh, is not just to remain absorbed in godliness, but to come down and draw down into the work, the Aveda Esek HaTorah VaMitzvahs, B'china Shuv Liyas Leis Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim, as he says on top of 1247. Just looking at it to refresh my own memory. And that's one with the Ava B'Tainugim of Kamayim. That becomes okay. Then the last paragraph that we learned is page 1247 till the top of 1248. It says, Al Pizeh Yuvan, Er Da'avda B'chomedecha Shaykh L'B'chinas Bin. As you recall, there was the two questions that he asked. One is, what's the connection? B'chomedecha is beyond Hagbala, beyond limits. Bina is a structure, it's understanding. So how do you connect the two? And we learned before that Bina is connected b'chomedecha. So he explains, because dafka through the Hamokah, we're talking now, not Bina, the external dimension of Bina. That is indeed a lower level. And that is where it's expressed in a very full expressive way, b'chol me'idecha, where you feel it, it's expansive and so on. But when you go to the higher level of Bina, Hamokah b'meich machshavte, that this is all connected. Bina, the true nature of Bina is not about expansion, it's about experiencing a higher reality. And that higher reality is like a nekuda that causes the person not to expand, but to contract actually. In other words, the bitla of lesbe chivra megav the chika megav the chika the rechima de la yochel lemizbel. So Bina is experiencing the awe, similar to Chachma, of something far greater than itself. And that causes a contraction, a bittul, basically a nullification of the person's being. That's what he says. And this is connected to the level of Bina, the highest level of Bina. Yeah. So how do you come to that level? Like we said, that comes because negei benefesh. We're not talking about Bina contemplating on godliness and awakening an emotion of love and awe on a regular level. We're talking now where a person feels his very existence is dependent on it. And when he says, that's what he says. So he says like this, I'm just reading. And here he brings another example, the example of the two Balidinin who are standing in a court of law before Dayanim, and they're dealing with a very large, substantial sum of money, is what they're dealing with. So because it's so negei b'him, to use the aces, negei le b'chaya nafshe mamish, that's why hasaska shalei hu rak b'seichel shemaschaka ma'ed b'ten. He will then delve into it with such passion and so much commitment, because it's negei b'nefesh to him. That's the large sum of money that he's talking about as an example. So he'll come up with ideas and innovative theories and arguments that a regular Chacham Gadol would not have come up with, because it's not negei to nefesh. It's not negei to his very existence. V'asibel zehu tekev avos hamomen v'tekev avos atzmei al dera b'chol meidecha mamish kivin shenegei la'atzmusei. So he's using a very material example where a person is completely consumed, because let's say you're talking about millions of dollars. So his mind is going to be overactive in developing every possible argument in order to win this case. So that's the moshel that he's giving. Even though it's only intelligence, but because this intelligence is now seeking to achieve something that's negated to his avos asmei, to his love of his own very self, so therefore mishum zehu amoka agdela shalei b'sichle. So you see here, like everything gets so-called reversed, as we discussed. Usually we think in terms that the emotions are subjective. It's about your self-interest, and the mind comes to check that by being reflective and giving a more objective picture. Like he says in Tanya, chapter 9, that the midas, there he talks about the midas of the nefesh habamis. But in general, emotions are more subjective and the mind is more reflective. Here, we're talking about a higher level where you've reached a point where the mind has already tamed and refined those emotions. And now you're coming to another level where the opposite is happening, that the emotions, like the afrechim, are catapulting the mind to another place, that the mind should be completely consumed with what is negei be'etzem nefesh, to this neshama that wants to connect to God. So in earlier stages, you can't discuss that, because in the earlier, less mature stages, emotions are still about my interest. I don't see God as being my interest. That happens step by step, mutva murgish muskel. You come to a point where your emotions have been guided there, and your mind has trained the emotions, but now the emotions, what you've done is triggered and awakened the core emotions of the neshama that are connected to godliness. And that creates the fiery passion to the point of kleis nefesh. But we want to go one level higher. We don't just want the natural passion of the neshama that connects to God. We want it to also completely saturate the human being. So there comes the level of bina and chokhmah and das, where a person uses their mind to find more ways to relate to the godliness that the etzem and neshama naturally is connected to. So here you see how the emotions are affecting the mind to go higher, not to go lower, to go higher. But that came after that. After Eim Revetzes al Afrechim, first you needed the mother, Bina, to train the emotions. Once they're trained and they come to a point of appreciation and revealing the etzem and neshama, the ava, the deeper love, the hidden love within the soul, they now in turn, the Bina, etzem Bina, brings that to life in this fullest sense of the word, because you're concentrating with your mind on that which is negei benefesh, that your whole very existence depends on it, which is of course the higher level of b'chol me'edecha. So that is the middle of page 1247. So we see from this, nimtze sha'sichli hu gufa b'chinas b'chol me'edecha mamish. So we derive from this that the sichli now is not just an objective, separate contemplating on godliness. It itself is in a state of b'chol me'edecha, because the mind is being used to make the case and appreciate that which is negei benefesh b'chol me'edecha. So then he goes to the nimshal. Val derech ze yuvim b'yeser says beruchnius. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'll just go over this a little more in detail, however, because this is the last thing we learned. So I'm reading the second half of page 1247. The line begins with B'chinas b'chol me'idecha mamish. And if you're following in the text and you want the text, go to ayinbeis.com. You have the PDFs of these pages. She says, similarly, we'll understand B'yesa says with even more intensity. That when the divine idea and the love for godliness touches him, the geile, it's relevant to him, but pnimius liboy, in the depths of his heart. In other words, it's not just something that you're experiencing, but it's negei benefesh just as much. Millions of dollars in the physical example would be negei benefesh. Through that causes the person to delve into and use their mind to immerse themselves and their thought in godliness to the fullest possible extent. Because it's yours. It's negei benefesh to you. It's not just a theoretical thing. That doesn't dismiss the power of the contemplation that comes on lower levels, but it's obviously a far higher level when it's negei b'pnimius liboy. She says, "V'hainu kasher tchilu hisedes ha'ava al sogav hizbonus b'chinas chitzenis hamechen." So here he goes in the order that I just described. So it works like this. So first it begins on the lower level. The ava is awakened. Al sogav hizbonus b'chinas chitzenis hamechen. That a person is comprehending and contemplating in the Chitzenis HaMechen, which brings a Seder Sa'ava, so first it begins, if you think in a normal process, first you begin, you're not there yet. You're not in a place where Elokus and godliness is so negei benefesh, let's say like Gashmis is negei benefesh. So the first thing is you need to begin the process of the training and the education of the person to realize that godliness should be your primary interest. So that indeed creates a love, but it's still on a Chetzenius Halev level. Then comes Primis Halev, Primis Hamechen. So when the person first begins with that, and then comes the Primis Halev, so through these steps, he then comes to the maturity and the growth of the Ava, ba'efin kazeh asher Ava lekis ki esle inyan nafshi shenegele b'primius liboy. So just on a very basic level, when you begin any process of appreciating something, even let's take about two human beings, two people who ultimately get married and love each other in the fullest possible way. It doesn't begin that way. First they meet, they date, they communicate, they engage with each other. They slowly start to appreciate each other. So the midas are there on a very basic level, but the most thing is important that the mind is appreciating through getting to know another person. Your mind says this person is is precious and has many qualities, and it's worthwhile to love this person. When you come to that point, it's still on a level that the mind is informing the emotions, and together there are emotions. Then you come to a point where it leads you, where, like he says, the next step, primis halev, where you're beginning to appreciate it on a much deeper level, and ultimately it comes that this person that you have met is now, you can't live without them. Which in the beginning it wasn't that way. When you first met the person who would become your spouse, you can't say they were indispensable to you and you couldn't live without them. You didn't even know them. But now you're coming to a point you can't live without them. So now how is the moichin working? Very different than the beginning. The mind was exploring and evaluating and looking into things and trying to determine whether this is the right person for you. Now, the other way around, the emotions are so deeply connected, you're so attached to this person. So now the mind is not about whether this person is worthy of loving. Now it's about how to love them in the deepest possible way, because it's negei benefesh. So the mind is essentially working together, or even being informed by the emotions. But we're not talking here about emotions that are just a person is impulsively attracted to something, because the impulses have already been guided by the mind that led you to a point in saying this wasn't just an impulsive thing. The emotions initially are impulsive. The mind trains and guides those emotions to become more deliberate. And then the other way around, the emotions begin to then become so much that you are so attached. It's so, you can't live without this person. So therefore the mind now is immersed to doing everything possible to understanding, like he says these words here. So this whole mind is immersed in this. In the parentheses, he says, so this is now at a point where it's not like you're desiring godliness, is that you sense that Etzem Elikus is your atzmi primi, it is who you are. It's your very core essence. Okay. And at this point, you can't even be distracted by anything. Nothing will pull you away, because once you feel it's negei b'nefesh, that you can't live without it, you're not going to be masir das. You're completely obsessed, completely consumed with godliness. Now, as I said, we can relate to it much more in physical ways, because that's what we are. We're physical beings. But the Rebbe Rashab is making it very clear that it can also be experienced, and even greater, with God, that type of love with Hashem. Okay. And then the final last section, he goes like this. Umaymik bezeh sichle machshavte umaskil bezeh haskolas gdelis umasig hasogas gdelis made. And now, because this is so important to you, you're not just learning it or studying it or contemplating on it in a sense, a certain way that's not yours. It's about you and your very essence. So a person delves into it with his mind, with his thought, conceives great haskalas, great ideas, and comprehends great comprehensions. Ma'oid, gedelis ma'id. Ve'hein sichlin be'etzem be'atzmis ha'sechel, lo b'bchinas katnus ha'sechel. This is now seichel on its highest level possible, because of the deep connection. The seichel is reaching into the reservoir of its deepest resources. This is not coming from the more limited seichel that's within the midah. That's what he's referring to, of course, the seichel that helped give birth to the midah, or helped guide it and help train it. And it's even, and it's also higher from the inner, deeper understanding, but it's still an understanding that's more seichel, not so much about your core being. Because now it's not just quantitative, but it's qualitatively completely different level of sichlim and asagas. Sichlim is most likely chachma, and asagas is bina. Then in the parentheses, he gave the example, tachlis ha'idiyah shalei neda, that the ultimate of knowing is getting to a place that's beyond knowledge. So he's comparing it, because you're now talking about the mind isn't just understanding rational ideas, but it's actually experiencing something that's beyond the rational. It's basically where the mind, as we've discussed, experiences something greater than our own rational structures. Okay, and that's Elikus Negele. By Iker, I'm just going to read the last 5 lines now, at the bottom of page 1247. By Ikerhu, and the primary thing here is Hamoka B'Yeser. By Ikerhu Hamoka B'Yeser. The primary thing is the very deep investment or immersion. Shazel L'Maylam HaSoga, that's higher than just plain comprehension. So he's bringing now the language of das into this. That it's not just you're understanding it, but you recognize it. It resonates. The hergish hasaga, you feel it in the mind. You feel and you sense the reality of this. And finally, then he says in the parentheses, "V'amaskal al dover," and a person who really appreciates this or understands this, Yovin Shakora That this recognition or this resonance and this sense, this feeling is much higher, higher and higher than just regular recognition, resonance, and feeling. This is a delving into an immersion, how everything in godliness, how everything is nullified before him, and how Hashem Agdula, greatness, is exclusively in the domain of God. And we said even further, that God's great, that even greatness is nullified before God. He said this at the bottom of page 1246. And then the final line of the paragraph on top of page 1248, through this comes an increased awakening and stimulation in the inner and the core of his very soul canal. So that's where we've reached. So I'll tell you the truth, you can review this many times. It deserves many reviews because it's quite high levels. But essentially, to sum it up briefly, we begin our lives, we begin Aveda on the level of just basic behavioral. So you appreciate, God says, do Torah mitzvahs, you do Torah mitzvahs. He called that mutva. There's a deeper level of that when you appreciate what godliness is about, but you don't really feel it. Is betalumas libi, like he says in Tanya chapter 16. But you know, your mind tells you it's worthy of loving this. And as we grow, we're essentially growing both emotionally and cognitively and intellectually to appreciate what God is. So on one hand, we move from the natural to something that's beyond just the natural instincts of a person, where the mind can objectively appreciate God and what God really represents as far as a higher reality goes. But then, as we get to higher levels of contemplation, then something else is triggered. The natural, deep, essential love of the soul to God is now awakened, and it in turn starts informing the mind. So the mind till now was the one that was training the midas, the emotions. But now the emotions are in turn feeding the mind because the emotions feel the etzem connection. The mind, its mila is that it can help you get beyond your own subjectivity and appreciate intellectually in a more objective way godliness. But what it doesn't have is the natural passion. Mind is not about natural passion. A mind is not passionate altogether. A mind can experience passion. What we talked about, sichlim, midas sichlim, where the mind is excited, but it's still intellectual experience. So when you can also trigger and bring into the equation, then the natural love, which makes it negei b'nefesh, that you can't live without it, and the mind now is using all its power because you can't live without it. So then you come to a point where it's the midas have become midas sichlim, and the seichel is being fed by this profound passion that it's negei to my very being, my very existence. So you have the best of both worlds. The best of the mind, but it's not just a detached mind, like in lower levels. You have the best of the emotions, the natural connection to God, and it's all about an experience that's greater than you are. So yes, it turns around that the subjective emotions that once were only interested in your own self-interest and your own survival, your own needs, have not just been trained, but actually you've revealed the emotions that they feel that their very need is godliness. We don't begin that way. If someone asks a regular person, what's the most important thing that's close to you? They'll talk about their own needs, whether it's food, drink, the love of their lives, or things that they can relate to, or money, as we discussed. But the truth is the neshama has its natural love to God. So when a person can awaken that, so now you have that going for that's fully active. At the same time, the mind, as he said, if it was just those emotions itself, It would be b'chol moedecha, the lower level. The mind brings it all to another dimension altogether, because the mind is able to integrate it and internalize it, like he said, where it's not just b'chitzenius bilvad, but here it's completely silent, but it's completely transformative. The silent sound that he spoke about before, the atzmizdika connection. And if you want to understand why the mind is so vital, he explains that on page 1246. The difference between that passionate, natural love of God without meichin, or at least minimal meichin, and how it is when you have etzem habina at work. So on the bottom of page 1245 and 1246, that paragraph is where that's explained, if you want to go over it again. So that's a summary of the summary that I just made. Okay, now, does anybody want any clarity, any questions till this point? If not, I will continue. I'll start a new paragraph, but I know this is plenty of material here to integrate and assimilate. Since we didn't learn for a little while, I wanted to just ask if anybody wants me to clarify anything more. No? Okay. Just one thing, I'm just thinking of one thing. 1 second. Okay, so let's begin the next paragraph on page 1248. So literally the top third line. And now he's going to bring it back to what I referred to before on page 1243, where he spoke about Ibbur Sheini and Ibbur Sheini. So Ibbur Sheini is the Ibbur we spoke about, the beginning of the process. A child in its mother's womb is a state of Ibbur, pregnancy. So the child is completely dependent on its mother. You don't have any full-blown emotions. They're just being developed and just really being born. And that's why even in the state of Ibbur, there are no real emotions that you can talk about tangible. It's just natural instincts and reflexes of the child. Even when the child is born, especially the first moments and the first days, the first weeks and months, the child is still in a state of not Ibbur literally, it's not pregnancy anymore, the child has been born, but everything is still very natural, instinctive, and reflexive. That's called Ibbur Zah in Bina. The words on 1243, the word he used was Ibbur Zah bebeten ima, the pregnancy of the midas in the womb of the mother. Ima being Bina, the Afrechim, the chicks, the offspring are bebeten ima, so they're completely under the protection of the mother that is giving birth to them. That's called Ibbur Rishon. Then the child will develop and begin to have its own emotions and also tangible ones, begin to also recognize things. So the mind will start working as well. Well, the mind is working even when there's reflexive, I should say. Doesn't mean there's no mind at work, but the mind is completely about the natural. Like he said, the child is curled up, if you remember. The Gemara says the child is curled up, the fetus. So the mind is not standing upright like in a human being where the mind is the highest level. In a fetal position, the mind, Meichin, Chabad, is completely connected to Chagas. So the mind is like curled into the heart, so to speak. Then the child develops, and as we discussed now, develops, the emotions develop, the mind develops. Then there's going to be an Ibbur Sheini, and that's what we're going to discuss now. The Ibbur Sheini is now when the emotions are going upward, not that you have first the mother gives birth to the emotions. Bina gives birth to the feelings. Contemplation gives birth to emotions. But now you're discussing where emotions are in turn shalach to shalach ha'sa'im, not aim revetzas ala frechim, where the mother is returning back to her core place, and that too elevates the midas. But now the midas are being elevated to another level of Ibbur. They go through another gestation period, so to speak, and that's what he's going to talk about now. So this is directly referring to page 1243, where he began this discussion. Before he got into the question, before he got into B'chol Meidecha and Bina, which we explain now at length, the two levels of B'chol Meidecha. So he's going back to that discussion of the second stage of Bina. The first stage of Bina, remember, if you remember also, Sus is the journey that a horse leads its chariot or leads the rider, two stages as well. One as it goes downhill, and the other as it goes up. So he said there were two levels in Shem Sag, which is connected to Bina. One is as it goes down to its offspring, and now the offspring are catapulting it upward. So that's the second level, which he calls, as I said, he calls that Ibbur Sheini. So I'm just reading from page 1243 just to help us understand. So he says in the middle of page 12, top of the first third of the page 1233, he says like this. That says in Eitz Chaim, in order to have a mature mind in Zah, not katnus, the midas have to go through a second type of pregnancy. Now that doesn't exist in the physical sense, but spiritually they have to go through a second gestation period, a second stage. This Ibbur Sheini is that the midas now are going beyond the rational. The lower level, the Kamosha Ibbur hu shamidas ein lamata madas. In the first Ibbur, in the first pregnancy, which is the early stage of development, the first stage of development, the midas are below das. Moichin is not yet come into play. They're only b'chinas tivim. They're just natural, reflexive, behavioral emotions. It's only coming due to the wiring, to the very hatfa, how it's rooted in the nefesh. That's also only due to the etzem nefesh, but it's not etzem nefesh as we understand it in the highest levels. Etzem nefesh is simply the natural way that child's emotions are developed. But they're in a state of tachlis hakatnus. They're completely katnus. They're completely in an immature and an undeveloped state. You don't even have real midas yet. You don't have tangible and palpable emotions yet. So I'm reading there because I think it will help us understand where we're going now here. So he continues. And even though the natural reactions of a child are very intense, because you can see a child can burst out crying, the emotions are intense. You can't call it a defined emotion. It's more just the natural needs of the child, and its natural instincts are crying out, so to speak. So it's gili hateva v'ashrosha shebenefesh. And he gives the example, kamei habehema, she'en la midas like tekev hateva shlo, like a behema, like an animal. An animal has feelings, but you don't call them midas. It's just its intense natural expression. You don't call it a defined emotion. She'en ze b'chinas midah. Because midah means some form of defined expression of midah. Let's say the midah of ava, the midah of yira, some form of definition, something that you can tangibly define. Whereas if you talk about just a natural expression, like a behemoth, that's that level. The same thing, kamay kain who be Ibbur Sheini, kamay kain b'chinas Ibbur Sheini. Ibbur Sheini now is the midas of the other end of the spectrum. The midas that after they've been matured, and the mind has grown. We're talking now, the mind is absolutely a big part of the process. So, shehila ma'ila tam v'das, not lamata. Now we're talking about that we've reached higher than tam v'das, the midah, not just the natural instinctive midah as a child, a newborn child, What we're talking about now, that's L'mayla Matam V'das, Ava B'chol, Ava, and here he introduced, this is the Ava's B'chol Ma'idecha, She Ava HaBilti Mugbelas, U'b'chinis Bitl B'mitzir Shem is Batl M'mahusei L'gamri. Very different expression. In the Ibbur Sheini, the Midah is all about its natural expression, period. Here we're talking about the natural expression that comes after and higher than structure, that is completely mizbat memahusei legamri in this all-consuming love. So now,
which page
then
are
he
you
went
reading?
to explain.
One second. Which page?
Well, hold on a second. 1 second. Okay. So then he went off to explain the question about Bina and B'chol Meidecha. How do they fit? How does the structure of Bina fit with the so-called Bligvul, the beyond structure of B'chol Meidecha? That we explained. Now that we've explained it, how do we explain it? Because Bina, on its higher level, is Negei B'nefesh. So now Bina is using its mind to connect to something that's beyond the mind, because it's negated to the very existence of the person, which of course we're talking now the Ava, the Midas as they are, L'mayla Matam V'das, and that's the Ibbur Sheini, because they come through Bina as well, because Bina contemplates. And we just said Bina, the Atzmi's Bina is contemplating on something that's Negei B'nefesh. So with that, we'll understand now what he's going to say in page 1248, the idea of Ibbur Sheini. But it's critical to understand that this is flowing straight from what we learned till now. That's why I went over page 1243. And now he's going to go into the Kol Zeh Inyan Ibbur Sheini. But you want to ask something? Go ahead.
No, okay, you answered already. Thank you.
Okay. Now, we still need to clarify what this Ibbur is, because are the Midas informing Bina, or Bina informing the Midas? When you say Ibbur, it sounds like it's the mother that is informing the children, the offspring, the emotions. But we just said now that the emotions are also feeding Bina, because the emotions now feel that it's Negei B'nefesh, which is an emotional thing that you fundamentally feel you can't live without godliness. And that in turn is causing the mind to be maimik daite, like he says, to completely immerse itself. So let's see how he's going to explain what this meaning of Ibbur is. The Kol Zeh, he says, Hu Inyan Ibbur Sheini. I'm reading line 3 on page 1248. All this is the inyan of the second pregnancy that we discussed earlier 5 pages ago, 1243. Shezeh b'chinas ava pnimis she'esa aliyah v'agboah ba'ameichen. An interesting take here. This is the inner love that causes an elevation and a aliyah, and to elevate an agba and to lift ba'ameichen in the mind. Liyas b'chinas atzmis mamish. That they too, the mind should experience something atzmis. Like someone who's is conceiving ideas and innovating to something that's negele benafshe. So the midas bring the element that's negated to your very existence. The mind on its own would not have that. Let's put it very, very bluntly, very simply. If, for example, God forbid, a neshama did not have natural, passionate, natural love to godliness, like he speaks in Tanya, the ava mushuteres that every Jew, every neshama has, like he says in Tanya, Perik Yud Ches Yutes, and because of that, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, the soul of a human being is like a flame, and always wants to connect. It's like the natural love of a child to its parent. So like he says in Perik Beis in Tanya, Vayipach Ba'apov Nishmas Chaim, that we are like a child, continues on, like a child, Boni Matam Lashem Alekechem, like a child. But imagine we were not a child of God's. We were created by God, and we use our minds to appreciate what godliness is. That in turn awakens emotions. And now you want to have a relationship with God, but that's like a relationship with a stranger, not because God is your etzem. It's because God is such a higher reality that it makes sense to want to connect to something that's not superficial or mortal and limited, but something that's infinite and eternal, and all the qualities we talked about. L'cha Hashem Agdula. That would be that scenario. You'd have the mind, you have emotions, but you would not have negei benefesh, because there's no fundamental connection. Even though it's true, God created us, but we don't have that natural ava atzmis that the neshama has. Here we're saying that the beginning process works that way. That first you begin by contemplating about God and appreciating that God is important. Hu chayecha, He gives you life and sustenance. But now we're talking about a level that you're coming to know that your very core essence can't live without godliness. So there's one stage where it's just an emotional experience that he called the lower level of B'chol Meidecha. But then you're talking about the Bina and Chachma. He was talking about Bina here. But in general, the mind is now completely consumed because you now know it's Negei B'nefesh. So the midas of that Etzem Ava, the Ava Atzmis that the Neshama has, is feeding now the mind, that the mind is going to go a lot deeper than it would ever have gone in the first scenario. The first scenario, you understand and contemplate on God as much as you can. It gives birth to emotions, and we're not saying that, I'm not dismissing it. It's an absolute level. It's a far higher level than people who are not loving God, but it's v'ahavta b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha. Fine. It didn't go to b'chol meidech. It goes to the edge of the river, as he said. The river to its banks. So it's b'chol levavcha, with all your heart, with all your soul. He spelled out what that meant on page 1240, on page 1245. Minatam v'aseichel, aval ein ze b'chinas ava atzmi shebenefesh. It's a mitzad chiyuv v'aseichel. And he says, b'chol levavcha ze avi mugbel is b'klei halev levad. What's the difference? The b'chol levavcha is only in the heart, and b'chol nafshecha, that ava mispashet is b'chol keiches hanefesh. Like he said, haverotz ledvar mitzvah. That the love extends also to your other faculties. They actually run to do a mitzvah. But this is still, as he puts it, mitzad gate level, he says, it's like a nor, a river, a river that's extended to the edges of the banks of its river. But it's still all, like he says, is spilus, but it's not ava b'chol meidecha. The natural love a child has to a father is not because of seichel. Seichel helps bring it to life and make you aware of it. But the ava atzmis adds a whole new dimension. Now it's negei b'nefesh to you. Now you're ready to die for it. Siris nefesh, chol meidecha. And so now your mind is immersing in a completely different way. Now it's not just something that your mind says is a good thing to have. It's your very essence, your very life is dependent on it. And that, therefore, the midas are Eisa Aliyah V'Agba Ba'Mechin. So in this Ibbur, in Ibbur Rishon, you can say the mother is the main force, that her food, her oxygen, her protecting the child is giving birth to it and making it grow. Here, the midas are returning the favor in a certain way, where they're causing an aliyah and agba on the meichin, that now the meichin are reaching a far higher, deeper core level that they would never have reached on their own. And now comes the other way around. That through hamokas haseichel, through the delving, immersion with your mind, that causes the ava, take of ava b'yeh. So essentially, it's like a feeding back and forth. The very it's negei b'nefesh. The midas are the midas ava primis causes the moichin to go far beyond they would ever go on their own, and that hamokas hadas, that concentration, nasa take of ava b'yeser, causes the love to become much more intense. Like you see, you could have the natural love of a child to a parent, great, but it's sometimes dormant. You don't feel it all the time. It's there all the time. But then when you awaken it, you become aware. So the natural love to the parent is feeding now, the mind is appreciating it and therefore delving into it deeper. But as you become more aware, the love also becomes, the fires of the love become stronger as well. So it's like thinking of it this way. Sometimes a person, for example, may have natural love to their parent. They do have natural love. Then suddenly you think about something your parent did for you, or of a quality that your father or mother has. And you would like say, wow, I really appreciate my father and mother for that. That's not necessarily the Ava Atzmis. That's the particular quality. And another person could also appreciate. But because it's your father, so now both things are happening. You appreciate it from a seichelic way, but it's also in turn now awakening and stimulating the natural love. So the natural plus the seichelic love both feed each other. So the natural causes the seichel to go far beyond just appreciation and just understanding al pitam v'das, the quality of your parent, because now it's negei b'nefesh, and in turn the concentration and focus on it causes the natural love to be stronger and more intense. V'hi b'chinas avas b'chol meidecha shebepnimius atzmis nafshei b'chinas bittul b'tachlis. And this, we're talking, is the highest level. This is the level of love b'chol meidecha, with all your might, with all of you. That's in the inner and core of the nefesh, of his nefesh. Bittul b'chinas bittul b'tachlis, like we spoke. It's not expansive. It's the opposite. You become completely nullified in its presence. B'chinas bittul b'tachlis. And through this, hu aliyah b'chinas bina. This is what causes an elevation in the level of bina, the ima, the mother. She kamei b'chinas hachachma. I would translate this, not that it is, that it becomes like the level of chachma. Like he said at the bottom of last page. So bina on its own is comprehension. But now the natural love, the etzem nefesh love, what he calls ava pnimis benafshe, is causing the bina to go to its etzem. So now bina is going to the place of chachma, and we learned chachma is not about yesh, it's about ayin. Bina on its own, not atzmis bina, is a level of understanding, and you understand. It's a lower level. But now the core connection that it's negei b'nefesh, that your very life is dependent, causes bina to go to a level that it's not focusing on itself and my understanding of it, but it's focusing on the same thing chachma is focusing. If you recall earlier, he said, why is bina the mother of the midas and not chachma? He said, because chachma is beyond. Chachma is about ayin. Bina hovers over the children, hovers over the offspring. Bina being a yes, I understand, therefore we can connect to and relate to the midas. To understand this better, we need to go back to this page here where he said this. Where was this? I believe it was page. Oh, we're going back a while now. This point that I just made is on page 1234, 1232, sorry. Aleph Reish Lamed Beit. 1232, he explains the difference between Chachma and Bina, but that's on a lower level. Now, the Midas, the Efrechim, that have matured, and Shalach to Shalach HaSa'im, that no longer do they need the mother to hover over them. On the contrary, they are causing the mother to be sent away. Sent away here means elevated to a place where it's now going side by side, Zivuk Sholem, the complete union, where Chachma and Bina are in the same stature. Not the mother is connected more to the children and the father is beyond and transcendent, but Bina now reaches a transcendent state because it's negei b'nefesh. So Bina involves itself, immerses itself, and reaches this level of Chachma. V'hu b'chinas yichud pnimi, the Abba v'Ima. This is the inner yichud of Abba v'Ima that I discussed as well earlier. I'm now talking about page 1236. That the Gili, as it is in Chachma, goes also into Bina. What's in Chachma? Chachma senses a higher reality all the time. It doesn't understand, it doesn't relate to how I understand godliness, but it's completely being absorbed by godliness. So the Midas are causing Bina to go back to the same level as Chachma, and that is Nimshal Gamkin Bina. I'm going to stop here because I see this is a whole subject matter. So what's happening now in this paragraph, besides connecting it back to Ibbur Sheini, he's also connecting it back all the way to the beginning of the subject, that in order for there to be the histaklus, Remember the Istaklus in the Metzach of Arechampin of Atik Yemen, Istaklus, that Chachma Bina gaze at that which is higher, comes through this whole process where the midas are now, this Ave Atzmis and Pnimis is causing Bina to go back to that level. So really what he's going back here to is all the way to page 1237. But to really appreciate it, I need more time. So I'll leave it for tomorrow. But he's really tying it all together, the last basically 10 pages. So we'll go slowly. If you picked up what I said right now, great. If not, I'll elaborate on this tomorrow. I'm going to stop here, but simply because it's too intricate here. We have to unpack it a bit. Okay, but anybody have any questions? Let's go up to that.
I have a question. Is it fair to say when it's saying that the Bina is essentially reaching to the level like Chachma, is it to say that Bina is somehow becoming batul or transformed itself, or is it, and I'm speaking in very generic terms here, so forgive me, Bina is actually understanding what this elokus even better, because ultimately understanding it requires this bittul. In other words, in order to really understand it, you actually go toward ayin. The very understanding of it forces Bina to move toward ayin. It itself is a fleshing out of the chachma of the higher level of godliness, but necessarily because understanding that pushes you in that direction of a hispatlus, do you understand my question?
Well, he's going in that direction, correct? We'll learn it inside, but this is the direction that he's going. That Bina begins first on the lower levels to nurture the midas, and then as the maturity continues, Bina will return to the level beyond, like what you call ayin, or the levels that are higher than keser, arich, atik, and experiencing something greater, higher reality. That's correct. That's the direction.
Rabbi Jacobson?
Yeah.
I have a question to ask you, and I don't know if this even fits in the subject matter or not, but you could tell me. There's a prophecy that says before Mashiach comes, there will be a time that the kids are the ones who are actually elevating their parents and bringing them back to religion. Would that apply to this subject matter, that the midot are basically, transforming the Bina to a higher level and Chachma to have the Shalom Zivug that we talk about? Is that is a fair statement to say maybe that's one of the manifestation of this concept?
Well, the end of Malachi, this is a verse, a pasuk in Malachi, in the prophet Malachi, where he says, "V'heshiv lev ovis al bonim, v'lev bonim al avesam." And it says there that basically the bonim, the children, will bring the parents back. You probably could connect it. I would like to see if the Rebbe Rashab himself refers to that verse anywhere here. He may. I haven't seen it yet. And if he doesn't, maybe there's a reason for that. But in general, it could be interpreted that way. I don't recall a Chassidus that actually interprets that verse in the way we're talking now. But it seems an intuitive connection, yeah. Is what I would say about that.
Thank you.
Okay. Fine. Anybody else want to ask or comment on anything? If not, we'll stop here. Basically, the top third of page 1248. And we'll continue. I'm going to elaborate. All this is going to become obviously more developed. And yes, the bigger picture, I see there's a few more pages on this topic. But we're getting there. Yeah. Okay.